In the closing years of the 19th century, a profound shift was underway in the American South. The period known as Reconstruction had promised freedom, opportunity, and the protection of rights for millions of formerly enslaved people. For a brief moment, there was hope that the nation could heal and rebuild on the principles of equality and justice. Federal troops stationed throughout southern states stood as a safeguard, ensuring that newly freed citizens could vote, pursue education, and begin building lives of dignity. But that protection was not destined to last. By 1877, federal soldiers began to withdraw from the South. What seemed like a political compromise in Washington quickly became a turning point in the daily lives of countless families. Without the watchful presence of federal forces, local power shifted back into the hands of white leaders who had long resisted change. These men were determined to restore the old order, and with the retreat of federal authority, their opportunity arrived. Almost overnight, the fragile progress of Reconstruction began to unravel. Black communities, once guarded by the presence of national troops, found themselves exposed to laws and practices designed to strip away hard-earned freedoms. Local governments passed new rules restricting access to voting. Schools that had been integrated or built with great sacrifice were defunded or closed. Social spaces once shared in cautious optimism were segregated by law and custom. It was not simply a change in policy, it was the beginning of a system that would come to define an era, an age of legalized separation and deepening racial inequality. For ordinary people living through this transformation, the experience was devastating. Imagine a farmer who had just learned to vote, only to be turned away from the ballot box by new requirements he could not possibly meet. Picture a young student who walked proudly into a classroom one year, only to be told the next that he no longer belonged there. These were not abstract shifts in governance, they were daily losses that reshaped the possibilities of life itself. The withdrawal of federal troops marked the end of protection and the start of a long struggle under laws that enforced separation in schools, buses, restaurants, and neighborhoods. Families who had tasted a glimpse of freedom now faced the harsh reality of living under systems built to keep them in a lower place. This chapter of history reminds us how quickly progress can be rolled back when protections vanish and power shifts unchecked. As we begin this journey through one of the most complex and painful periods in American history, it is important to reflect not only on the events themselves but also on the lessons they hold for us today. History is not just about the past, it shapes the world we live in right now. If you find value in uncovering these hidden stories and exploring the truths that shaped our world, please support this channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Together, we can shine a light on the past so that future generations understand its weight, its warnings, and its enduring importance. When the dust of Reconstruction settled, the South entered a new era, one that would shape daily life for generations. It was not a single law or a sudden declaration that transformed society, but a slow, deliberate weaving of rules and customs that touched nearly every corner of existence. These laws created boundaries that told people where they could sit, where they could live, and even where their children could learn. It was a system carefully designed to divide, and it was written into the fabric of everyday life. Picture a child in a small southern town at the turn of the century. He wakes up early, books in hand, eager to attend school. His parents, proud yet cautious, remind him to stay safe and remember the rules. When he reaches the edge of town, he sees two buildings. One is bright and well kept, its windows polished, desks lined neatly in rows. The other is smaller, weathered by time, with hand-me-down supplies and crowded benches. The choice of which building he enters is not his to make, it was already decided for him by the laws of his state. This separation extended far beyond the classroom. Boarding a train meant knowing exactly which car you were expected to sit in. Streetcars had designated sections, and stepping into the wrong one could lead to humiliation or worse. Even something as simple as drinking water in public became a reminder of division, with signs dictating who could use which fountain. These daily rituals, seemingly small, reinforced a constant message: boundaries must not be crossed. The laws were not written to encourage fairness but to ensure distance. Housing patterns became rigidly controlled, with neighborhoods divided by invisible yet unbreakable lines. Families knew where they were allowed to settle and where they were not welcome. Crossing those boundaries, even in search of better opportunities or safer streets, could lead to trouble. In this way, entire communities were shaped by the weight of rules that determined not just property lines but the very possibility of progress. Public life mirrored this same pattern. Theaters, restaurants, and parks were all marked by separation. Imagine a family on a summer evening, hoping to enjoy a movie or a picnic, only to find themselves directed to a separate entrance or a smaller section set aside for them. What might seem like an ordinary night out was transformed into a reminder of exclusion. Step by step, these laws worked their way into the simplest human experiences, leaving no space untouched. For those who grew up in this environment, the rules became a constant companion. They shaped how people walked, where they stood, and what they expected from their future. A bus ride was never just a bus ride, it was a lesson in knowing one's place. A trip to the courthouse was not just about justice, it was about which door you used and where you sat once inside. These details, repeated day after day, became a kind of script, written not by choice but by law. Yet within this carefully constructed system, there was resistance. Families built their own institutions, churches that served as places of worship and community centers, schools that fought to provide knowledge despite limited resources, businesses that offered a measure of independence in a restricted world. These acts of creation were quiet forms of defiance, ways of claiming dignity in the face of limitation. The existence of these laws did more than restrict movement, they created two separate realities within the same land. One reality offered access, opportunity, and comfort. The other required resilience, adaptability, and constant awareness. For those living under these restrictions, every step outside their door was a negotiation with a system that had already decided what they could and could not do. This was not just about legal codes written in courthouses, it was about how life unfolded on every street corner and in every public space. The laws of the South in this period built an invisible wall, one that was reinforced not with bricks but with rules, signs, and unspoken threats. It was a wall that shaped childhoods, limited dreams, and dictated the rhythms of daily life. As time moved forward, these patterns grew deeper. A child who learned to step aside on a sidewalk became an adult who knew not to question why certain opportunities were forever out of reach. A young student in an underfunded school became a parent who understood the obstacles their own children would face. The system was self-sustaining, feeding on its own rules to ensure its survival. And yet, even in the face of this deeply entrenched separation, there remained sparks of hope. Stories passed down in families spoke of resilience and pride. Music, art, and literature became outlets for voices that refused to be silenced. Communities gathered strength in the very spaces they were confined to, turning them into foundations for future struggles for justice. The story of these laws is not just one of division, it is also one of endurance. It reminds us that even in times when rules are designed to confine, the human spirit continues to seek ways to rise above them. This chapter of history is not simply about separation, it is about the strength it takes to live within boundaries while dreaming of a world without them. In the years following the Civil War, a new promise had been written into the nation's laws: the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race. For many families who had long been denied a voice in government, this amendment represented more than words on paper, it was a doorway to participation, a chance to shape the future. In towns across the South, newly registered citizens lined up at polling stations with pride. For the first time, ballots carried the weight of dreams that stretched far beyond the present. But promises made in the Constitution did not always find protection in practice. Local leaders, unwilling to accept this shift in power, began to create barriers. These were not the obvious chains of an earlier era. They were subtler, crafted in the language of rules and requirements. Each law was carefully designed to look fair on the surface while closing the door to those it was meant to exclude. Consider the poll tax. On its face, it was simply a fee, a small payment required before casting a ballot. But for families who struggled to earn enough for food and clothing, that small fee was a wall. A man might work the fields all year only to find, when election season came, that the right he had been promised was beyond his reach because his pockets were empty. The ballot box became a privilege purchased, not a right guaranteed. Then came the literacy tests. Officials claimed these were about ensuring an informed electorate. In reality, they were tools of exclusion. Imagine walking into a courthouse, full of determination, only to be handed a sheet of paper with complex passages, sometimes drawn from obscure legal codes. For those who had been denied education for generations, these tests were nearly impossible to pass. Even for those who could read, the tests were administered with cruelty. The same official who handed one man a simple question might hand his neighbor a nearly impossible one, grading answers with complete subjectivity. Failure was almost guaranteed, no matter the effort. Perhaps the most cunning of these barriers was the grandfather clause. It stated that only those whose grandfathers had been eligible to vote could bypass the new rules. On the surface, it seemed neutral, but in reality, it was a trap. For many African American families whose ancestors had lived under systems that denied them rights, this clause closed the door entirely. Meanwhile, white citizens, whose families had long enjoyed access to the ballot, passed through the loophole untouched. It was a law that looked fair in writing but was deeply unfair in practice. These restrictions did more than block ballots, they silenced entire communities. Without representation, schools lacked funding, roads went unpaved, and voices in courtrooms went unheard. Decisions about taxes, laws, and justice were made without input from those most affected. The very foundation of democracy, the idea that government should reflect the will of its people, was hollowed out. The experience of attempting to vote during this time was often filled with frustration and humiliation. Picture a man who had fought for his country, standing in uniform, denied the right to vote because he could not produce a receipt for a tax he could not afford. Picture a mother who believed in the promise of progress, turned away from the courthouse after being told her answers on a test were wrong, even though she knew them to be right. These stories multiplied across counties and states, until silence became the enforced reality for millions. And yet, even as these systems of disenfranchisement tightened their grip, there was resistance. Churches became places not just of worship, but of political education. Neighbors shared knowledge, helping one another prepare for the unfair tests, even though success was rare. Community leaders spoke out, writing articles, organizing meetings, and planting seeds of determination that would one day grow into movements for change. The very attempt to keep voices silent became a reason for those voices to grow stronger. What makes this chapter of history so striking is the way in which laws were used as weapons. Instead of outright denial, which the Constitution forbade, those in power turned to technicalities, fees, and loopholes. They built a maze so complicated that escaping it was nearly impossible. The effect was the same as outright prohibition, but cloaked in the appearance of legality. The disenfranchisement of this era teaches us a powerful lesson: rights can be promised, yet still denied through carefully crafted obstacles. It shows how the structures of democracy can be bent and twisted to serve those who fear losing control. And it reveals the extraordinary resilience of communities who, despite every effort to keep them silent, continued to believe in the possibility of a future where their voices would finally be heard. The ballot box is more than paper and ink, it is the symbol of belonging, the measure of citizenship, and the heartbeat of a free society. To have it withheld through taxes, tests, and clauses was to be told, day after day, that one's future did not matter. And yet, those who endured this injustice never stopped imagining a world where it did. That vision carried forward, fueling generations who would one day march, organize, and demand the promise written into the Constitution be made real for all. In the late 19th century, a single decision from the nation's highest court changed the course of history. It did not arrive with the sound of marching armies or the drama of a fiery speech. Instead, it came in the measured language of judges, dressed in black robes, seated in a quiet chamber in Washington, D.C. But the weight of their ruling would echo far beyond those walls, shaping schools, neighborhoods, and daily life for generations. The case began with a simple act of defiance. A man boarded a train in Louisiana and sat in a car reserved by law for passengers of a different group. He did not make a scene, he simply sat, determined to challenge a system that dictated where he could and could not go. His quiet protest carried with it a bold question: could a democracy truly call itself free if it forced its citizens to live apart? That question traveled all the way to the Supreme Court. When the justices delivered their decision in 1896, the answer was not what many had hoped for. The court declared that separation was permissible, so long as the facilities provided were equal. With that phrase, separate but equal, a legal shield was handed to states eager to enforce division. It was a moment that transformed prejudice into policy, turning personal bias into the law of the land. On paper, the idea suggested fairness. But in practice, it opened the door to imbalance. Imagine two schools, one with new books, polished desks, and teachers supported by ample resources, the other with worn materials, crowded classrooms, and crumbling walls. Both were labeled equal under the law, though anyone who stepped inside could see the difference. The ruling allowed such disparities to flourish unchecked, because as long as doors existed on both sides of the divide, the courts deemed justice served. The decision rippled outward quickly. Train cars, theaters, restaurants, even public parks were divided by signs and rules that drew sharp lines between citizens. A trip to the post office or a walk through town became a reminder that the highest court in the land had sanctioned the separation. What might have been challenged as unfair or unconstitutional was now supported by legal precedent. Those who resisted could be dismissed with the phrase, "It's the law." For children growing up during this time, the ruling was more than a legal matter, it became the backdrop of their childhood. They learned early which door to enter, which side of the bus to sit on, which part of the park was open to them. These boundaries were not natural, they were constructed and reinforced by a decision made far away by men who never saw the daily consequences of their words. Yet within this climate of division, there were still voices of dissent. One justice, writing alone, warned that the ruling would one day be remembered as a stain on the nation's conscience. He argued that the Constitution was meant to be colorblind, that it did not recognize classes or divisions among citizens. His words, though ignored at the time, planted a seed of truth that future generations would return to when the struggle for justice reignited. What makes the ruling so haunting is its longevity. It was not a fleeting policy or a temporary experiment. For more than half a century, separate but equal provided cover for laws and practices that kept communities apart. Entire lifetimes were shaped within its shadow. Children were born, grew up, and became adults without ever experiencing the kind of equality the Constitution promised them. And yet, despite the weight of this ruling, the story did not end there. Across the country, families, educators, and activists quietly challenged the logic of separate but equal. They collected evidence, showing the vast differences between schools and public services. They told their stories in courts and newspapers, insisting that what was called equal was anything but. Over time, their persistence built a case strong enough to shake the very foundation of the old ruling. The Supreme Court's 1896 decision reminds us how powerful words on paper can be. It shows how a single phrase, written in the calm language of law, can carry enormous consequences for millions of lives. But it also reveals the limits of even the highest authority. For though the court declared separation lawful, the human spirit continued to resist. People carried within them a vision of fairness that no ruling could erase, a belief that equality must be more than a word. Looking back, the decision stands as a moment when the nation turned away from its own ideals. But it also set the stage for a future reckoning, when the very people once silenced by separate but equal would rise to challenge it, proving that history bends not only by rulings and courtrooms but also by the courage of those who refuse to accept injustice as permanent. When the Civil War ended and the promise of freedom became a reality for millions, there was hope that life would finally begin anew. Families who had once toiled without pay now dreamed of owning land, building homes, and creating futures their ancestors had been denied. The soil of the South, rich and fertile, seemed to hold endless possibilities. But for many, those dreams quickly collided with a harsh system that replaced chains with contracts and fields with debts. This system was called sharecropping and tenant farming, and while it wore the mask of opportunity, it often functioned as a trap. Landowners, still holding vast tracts of property, offered recently freed families the chance to work the land. On the surface, it seemed like a partnership, labor in exchange for a share of the crop. But beneath the promise of independence lay the reality of dependency. Picture a family in the early years after the war. With no savings, no tools, and no livestock, they accepted a deal from a local landowner. He would provide seeds, plows, and a cabin to live in. At harvest time, the crop would be divided, half for the farmer, half for the landowner. But when debts for supplies, rent, and fees were added up, the farmer's half often shrank to almost nothing. The system was designed to keep families returning year after year, bound not by physical chains but by the weight of debt. If the harvest was poor, the farmer owed more. If the weather destroyed crops, the debt still remained. Children who should have been in school spent their days picking cotton or planting rows, because the family needed every hand to survive. Tenant farming, a variation of this arrangement, promised slightly more freedom. Farmers rented land directly and had more say in what to plant. Yet even here, the cycle was hard to escape. Prices for cotton and other crops were unpredictable, and merchants who extended credit often charged sky-high interest. With every season, the ledger seemed to tilt in favor of the landowner or merchant, never the farmer. What made this system particularly devastating was the illusion of progress it carried. On paper, families were no longer enslaved, they signed contracts, moved into their own cabins, and tended their own plots of land. But in practice, their lives remained tethered to forces beyond their control. Every spring began with hope, every fall ended with disappointment, and the gap between promise and reality grew wider. For many black families, this cycle echoed the hardships of the past. Freedom had opened the door, but economic bondage kept them from walking through it fully. The inability to build wealth, to pass down land or resources to their children, meant that poverty stretched across generations. In some places, the very land they worked once belonged to their ancestors in chains, a bitter reminder that ownership was still out of reach. Yet within these struggles, there were also stories of resilience. Families leaned on faith, community, and determination to survive. Neighbors shared food when harvests failed. Parents taught children to read at night after long days in the fields, knowing that education was the key to breaking free from the cycle. The human spirit, though burdened, refused to surrender completely. The legacy of sharecropping and tenant farming extended well into the 20th century. Long after the Civil War was over, its shadow still lingered across the South. It kept entire communities tied to a system that profited from their labor while denying them true independence. The rows of cotton stretching into the horizon were not just crops, they were reminders of promises broken and opportunities withheld. To understand this period is to see how freedom was redefined in ways that limited its meaning. A person might be free from physical bondage, yet still constrained by economic forces designed to keep them in place. It is a lesson about how power can adapt, reshaping itself to maintain control, even when the old systems have been swept away. And so, the story of sharecropping and tenant farming is more than just an account of agriculture. It is the story of families who worked the soil with hope in their hearts, only to find themselves caught in invisible chains of debt. It is a reminder that freedom without opportunity can feel hollow, and that true independence requires more than the right to labor, it requires the chance to reap the full rewards of one's work. The cotton fields of the South were places of sweat, struggle, and sacrifice. But they were also places where determination was planted alongside the crops. Despite the hardships, these families carried forward traditions, built communities, and held on to dreams of a future where their children might stand on land of their own, free not just in name, but in reality. When the sun dipped below the horizon in many southern towns during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a deep unease spread through certain communities. Nightfall did not simply signal the end of a day, it brought with it the possibility of fear, the knowledge that violence might strike without warning. For those who lived under its shadow, this fear was not imagined. It was carefully cultivated, enforced by groups determined to maintain control through terror. One of the most infamous of these groups was the Ku Klux Klan. They did not act as official officers of the law, yet their presence carried the force of authority. Their uniforms, white robes and hoods, were meant to disguise identities, but more importantly, they were symbols. They announced power, menace, and a promise of punishment to anyone who dared challenge the social order they wished to protect. Lynching became their most brutal tool. These public killings were designed not only to end a life but to send a message. The gatherings drew crowds, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, where the spectacle was treated as both warning and entertainment. The victims were often chosen not because they had committed crimes, but because they represented defiance, an attempt to vote, to own land, to speak out, or simply to exist with dignity. The effect was devastating. Families lived with the knowledge that even small acts could make them targets. A farmer who prospered too much might draw attention. A father who tried to register to vote might never return home. A young man who looked someone in the eye at the wrong moment could be accused of an insult and face deadly consequences. Terror was not random, it was systematic. It kept entire communities silent, subdued, and hesitant to pursue opportunities that might otherwise have been theirs. Intimidation extended beyond violence. The mere rumor of Klan activity was often enough to change behavior. A knock at the door in the middle of the night, the sudden disappearance of a neighbor, or the appearance of a burning cross on a hillside all served as reminders of who held the power. Even those who were never directly attacked lived in constant fear of what could happen. This climate of terror was not only about individual acts, it reinforced a system. It sent a clear message that legal rights granted on paper could be stripped away in practice. Courts and local authorities frequently turned a blind eye, or worse, quietly approved. Juries seldom convicted perpetrators, and police rarely intervened. In many cases, the very people tasked with upholding justice were themselves sympathetic to, or even part of, the group spreading fear. For children growing up in this environment, the lessons were painful. They learned early to keep their voices low, to avoid drawing attention, to never challenge the boundaries placed around their lives. Dreams of advancement, education, land ownership, political participation, were hemmed in by the knowledge that ambition could carry a deadly price. Yet even in the midst of such terror, there were sparks of resistance. Communities gathered in secret to support one another. Churches became safe havens, not only for worship but for planning, teaching, and reminding one another that their humanity could not be erased. Families whispered stories of hope, instilling in their children the belief that a better world could someday be possible, even when the present seemed unbearable. The tragedy of this era lies not only in the lives lost but in the opportunities stolen. Generations were denied the chance to thrive because fear dictated their every step. But the resilience that grew in response to this oppression became the foundation for future movements. Out of the shadows of terror, leaders emerged who would one day confront the very system that sought to silence them. Looking back, it is clear that the violence and intimidation were not just random acts of cruelty, they were strategies of control. They ensured that laws meant to guarantee equality could be undermined by those unwilling to accept change. They kept entire communities in a state of enforced submission, where survival often meant silence. But history also shows that even the most oppressive systems cannot extinguish the will to fight for dignity and justice. The very fear meant to paralyze instead planted seeds of determination. In time, those seeds grew into a movement powerful enough to challenge not just the Klan, but the very foundation of inequality itself. The nights of terror were long, and the toll was immense. Yet the story of this period is not only about violence, it is also about the unbreakable spirit of those who endured it. They carried within them the strength to imagine a different future, and their endurance became a legacy that inspires us still. In the decades after Reconstruction, education and culture became battlegrounds as powerful tools of control. To those who sought to preserve the old social order, knowledge itself was dangerous. A mind that could read and write was a mind that could question, organize, and resist. And so, barriers were built, not of stone or iron, but of laws, customs, and intimidation, that kept black communities from fully realizing their intellectual and cultural potential. Schools for black children, when they existed at all, were often underfunded, overcrowded, and held together by the determination of teachers who worked with little pay and fewer resources. Textbooks were cast-offs from white schools, pages worn and words sometimes missing. Classrooms were small wooden buildings, heated by a single stove in winter, sweltering in summer, with leaky roofs that forced students to huddle together when the rains came. And yet, within these humble spaces, there was a fierce hunger for learning. Every word learned was an act of quiet defiance against the barriers designed to hold people back. But access to education was only one part of the struggle. Beyond the classroom, restrictions extended to what could be said, written, or even sung. Speech itself became a contested act. Those who spoke too boldly, who questioned injustice openly, risked losing their livelihoods, or worse. Newspapers run by black editors were often threatened or destroyed, their presses smashed to silence voices that dared to tell a different story. Ministers who preached sermons of dignity and equality were sometimes watched closely, their words considered dangerous because they lit sparks of hope in weary hearts. Cultural expression, too, faced obstacles. Music, art, and literature were powerful ways to preserve identity and share experience, but they were often dismissed, suppressed, or appropriated. A spiritual sung in a small church might never be heard outside those walls, while the same melody could later appear, stripped of its origins, on stages where its true story was forgotten. Writers who sought to publish were told their voices did not matter, or that their stories were not fit for serious audiences. Creativity thrived nonetheless, but often in hidden spaces, family gatherings, church services, community halls, where songs, poems, and stories could be shared without fear of ridicule or reprisal. The restrictions were not only about silencing, they were about reinforcing a hierarchy. By limiting education, those in power could argue that black communities were unprepared for leadership. By suppressing speech, they could claim there was no serious challenge to the status quo. By minimizing cultural achievements, they could dismiss a people's contributions as marginal or irrelevant. It was a cycle designed to maintain control, deny opportunity, then point to the absence of achievement as proof of inferiority. And yet, resistance took root in the very soil of oppression. Parents worked long hours but still found ways to send their children to school, sometimes walking miles each day. Teachers traveled from town to town, carrying books in worn satchels, determined to spread literacy where it was most needed. Writers and thinkers found ways to publish, whether through small community newspapers, pamphlets, or gatherings where words were passed from one person to another, kept alive in memory if not in print. Musicians created new forms, blues, gospel, jazz, that carried both sorrow and resilience, transforming pain into art that the world could not ignore. For those who lived through it, these small victories were monumental. A child who learned to sign her name could one day claim ownership of land. A preacher who found the courage to speak truth in his sermon might inspire a generation to demand more. A song sung in defiance could remind a whole community that its voice, though threatened, had not been extinguished. The story of these restrictions is not only one of limits but also of the extraordinary creativity and determination they inspired. In trying to silence a people, society inadvertently fueled a deeper resolve to speak, to write, to sing, and to dream. The very barriers meant to enforce submission became the backdrop against which a culture of resilience and brilliance emerged. Looking back, it is impossible to miss the irony. Those who worked hardest to restrict education, speech, and culture feared what might happen if these freedoms were fully embraced. And indeed, their fears were not misplaced. For out of the schoolhouses, pulpits, printing presses, and music halls grew a movement that would eventually challenge the foundations of inequality itself. Knowledge, expression, and culture could be delayed, but they could not be destroyed. Generation after generation found ways to carry them forward, planting seeds of change in the very places where silence had once been enforced. And from those seeds grew voices strong enough to reshape history. In the face of overwhelming challenges, there was a remarkable story of resilience unfolding across towns, farms, and neighborhoods in the South. While the weight of discrimination pressed heavily on everyday life, Black communities did not simply endure, they created. Out of struggle, they built institutions that provided both refuge and strength, weaving together the threads of survival and resistance into something lasting and profound. Schools were often the first priority. Parents who had themselves been denied the chance to learn were determined that their children would not grow up without knowledge. In many places, families pooled coins and labor to erect one-room schoolhouses. They built them from scrap wood, sometimes on church grounds, sometimes in open fields, wherever land could be spared. Teachers were treated like community heroes, entrusted with shaping the future through letters, numbers, and history lessons that affirmed both pride and possibility. Even when resources were scarce, the sight of children bent over slates and worn books represented hope, a declaration that education was a form of resistance. Churches, too, rose at the heart of these communities. They were more than places of worship. They were meeting halls, schools, political training grounds, and safe havens. Within their walls, people shared not only prayers but strategies for survival. Ministers often became leaders, guiding their congregations with messages of dignity and perseverance. Hymns carried both sorrow and joy, binding communities together in ways that no outside force could sever. The church bell that rang on Sunday mornings did more than call people to service, it reminded them that unity was their greatest strength. Businesses followed, born of necessity as much as ambition. In towns where access to white-owned stores was limited or humiliating, Black entrepreneurs created their own. Barbershops, beauty parlors, general stores, and restaurants emerged, offering goods and services within spaces of mutual respect. These businesses were not merely about commerce, they were declarations of independence, proof that communities could sustain themselves despite exclusion from the wider economy. Each successful business inspired others, creating networks of trade and trust that stretched from one town to the next. Social organizations filled another crucial role. Fraternal orders, mutual aid societies, and women's clubs became lifelines for those who had few other forms of support. Members contributed small sums to help bury the dead, care for widows, or provide for children left behind. These groups fostered solidarity, teaching the values of collective care and reminding each member that they were not alone in their struggles. Out of these circles grew leaders who would later shape national movements, trained first in the humble but powerful work of serving their neighbors. What made these efforts extraordinary was the spirit behind them. Each school, church, business, and organization was built in defiance of systems that sought to deny the possibility of progress. Every brick laid, every sermon preached, every ledger balanced represented more than survival. It was a quiet but unyielding stand against the idea that lives could be diminished or erased. Consider the story of a teacher who walked miles each day to reach her classroom, carrying chalk and paper in her satchel, determined to pass on knowledge even when her own life was under threat. Or the barber who turned his small shop into a community hub, where men discussed not only haircuts but also politics, family, and the latest efforts to organize for change. Or the women who gathered in kitchens to sew quilts, each stitch a symbol of care for families in need, while planning strategies to strengthen their neighborhoods. These acts, though small in scale, carried enormous weight. They built resilience into the very fabric of community life. They offered dignity in a world designed to strip it away, opportunity where there was none, and hope in times when despair seemed easier. They planted seeds for future generations, who would grow up surrounded not only by stories of hardship but also by examples of ingenuity, unity, and courage. It is important to remember that resistance did not always look like marches or protests. Sometimes, it was as simple as building a school where none was meant to exist, singing together in a church where voices could rise freely, or exchanging goods in a marketplace where fairness prevailed. These everyday acts were the foundation of survival, and they quietly undermined the very systems that sought to keep communities powerless. In time, these institutions became the backbone of larger movements for justice. The skills learned in church meetings, the pride nurtured in classrooms, the economic independence fostered in businesses, all of it prepared people for the struggles to come. What began as survival in the face of oppression became the groundwork for organized resistance that would one day change the nation. Through it all, one truth shines brightly: even under the heaviest burdens, communities found ways to build. They created spaces of safety, culture, and opportunity, carrying forward traditions of resilience that endure to this day. These schools, churches, businesses, and organizations were not only places, they were symbols of a people's determination to write their own story, no matter the obstacles placed in their path. It began as a quiet trickle, almost unnoticed at first. A few families packed their belongings into worn suitcases, tied bundles with twine, and boarded northbound trains. Some carried nothing more than the clothes on their backs and the determination in their hearts. They left behind farms, dusty roads, and the familiar rhythm of southern towns for destinations they had only heard about in letters or whispers. This trickle soon grew into one of the largest movements of people in American history, a journey that would reshape cities, culture, and the nation itself. For many, the decision to leave was born of desperation. Life in the South offered little beyond endless labor and constant danger. Wages were meager, opportunities limited, and the threat of violence never far away. Parents looked at their children and wondered what future awaited them if they stayed. Could a boy grow into a man without fear? Could a girl pursue education and independence without barriers closing in around her? These questions haunted families, and for countless households, the answer was to leave. The North and West became beacons of possibility. Letters from relatives who had gone ahead painted vivid pictures of bustling factories in Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, where jobs promised regular paychecks. Stories spread of Harlem in New York, where music, poetry, and art flourished, creating a cultural movement unlike anything the country had seen before. Out west, cities like Los Angeles offered sunshine and new beginnings, where migrants imagined they could carve out a life away from the heavy shadows of the South. Travel itself was an act of courage. Train stations filled with anxious families clutching tickets they had saved for months to buy. Some slipped away under the cover of night, not wanting to draw attention from landlords or employers who depended on their labor. Journeys often stretched for days, with long hours spent in cramped train cars or buses, children restless and parents weary, yet fueled by hope. Every mile traveled carried them further from the old world and closer to a new chapter. When they arrived, life was not easy, but it was different. Cities welcomed newcomers with both opportunity and challenge. Northern industries needed workers, and for many, factory jobs meant a steady income for the first time. Tenements filled quickly as migrants settled in neighborhoods where familiar accents and faces offered comfort in unfamiliar surroundings. Churches and community groups provided networks of support, helping new arrivals adjust to the fast pace of city life. Yet alongside opportunity came obstacles. Not all doors were open. Many migrants discovered that prejudice existed beyond the South, though it often took subtler forms. Housing was restricted to certain neighborhoods, and competition for jobs sometimes bred tension with other workers. Still, the difference lay in possibility. While hardships remained, there was room to climb, to dream, to imagine futures that had been unthinkable before. The movement transformed not only individual lives but the nation's cultural landscape. Out of crowded apartments and busy streets came new forms of music, jazz and blues, that carried the voices of migration, blending Southern roots with Northern energy. Writers and poets chronicled the journey, their words capturing both the pain of departure and the thrill of arrival. Cities once unfamiliar became centers of creativity, where migrants and their descendants reshaped American art, literature, and politics. For those who left, memories of the South never faded. Letters traveled back and forth, filled with updates about new jobs, marriages, and children born in the North. At holidays, trains and buses carried some travelers back home to visit, though many never returned permanently. The South was part of their identity, but their futures were tied to the places where opportunity had finally begun to open its doors. Generations later, the legacy of this migration can still be felt. Families who moved north and west built foundations that allowed their children and grandchildren to pursue education, careers, and dreams that had once seemed impossible. Entire neighborhoods, from Chicago's South Side to Harlem's 125th Street, carry the echoes of those journeys in their music, food, and traditions. What makes this story so powerful is not simply the scale of the movement but the courage behind each choice. Leaving home is never easy. It means saying goodbye to familiar landscapes, to loved ones buried in southern soil, to childhood memories that cling to every street and field. But for millions, the promise of dignity and opportunity outweighed the pain of departure. The Great Migration, as it came to be known, was more than a search for jobs or escape from hardship. It was a collective declaration of possibility. It was millions of voices refusing to be silenced, millions of footsteps carrying determination across miles of track and pavement. It was the reshaping of America, one family, one journey, one act of hope at a time. As the years passed and laws began to change, the shadow of the Jim Crow era did not simply vanish with the stroke of a pen. Its mark remained etched into the fabric of American life, woven into neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. Generations grew up carrying the weight of decisions and structures built long before they were born. What had once been legal codes turned into unwritten rules, habits, and disparities that continued to shape the everyday experiences of millions. The scars were not only social but economic. Families who had been denied fair wages or blocked from owning land carried those losses forward, creating a gap in wealth and opportunity that widened over time. Where one family could pass down property, savings, or a business, another had little more than memories of labor that had enriched others but brought no lasting security. That imbalance, created decades ago, still echoes in the stark differences seen in wealth and housing across the country today. The political scars were just as deep. For decades, countless voices had been silenced, excluded from shaping the laws and policies that governed their lives. Even when voting rights were legally restored, the legacy of suppression left behind a mistrust of systems that had failed to protect them. Barriers shifted shape, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, but the message remained: progress required constant vigilance. Culturally, the era left wounds of identity and belonging. Entire generations were told, both directly and indirectly, that their contributions were lesser, their presence unwelcome in certain spaces. And yet, from within that struggle, resilience grew. Music, literature, and art became powerful responses, shaping not only communities but the nation itself. The very voices once pushed aside became the heartbeat of cultural revolutions that the world would one day celebrate. Looking at the present, the legacies of that time are unmistakable. Inequality in education, in income, in health, and in justice did not appear overnight, they were cultivated through decades of exclusion. The neighborhoods divided by invisible lines, the opportunities unevenly distributed, the mistrust between communities, these are the living reminders of a system that once dictated nearly every detail of life. And yet, the story is not only one of scars but also of strength. The communities that endured Jim Crow built schools, churches, businesses, and networks of care. They passed down not only survival but determination, not only pain but pride. Each generation carried forward the dream of a more just world, refusing to let injustice define their future. The Jim Crow era left its mark, but it also left a lesson: that progress is never guaranteed, that freedom must be protected, and that silence in the face of injustice allows scars to deepen. The story of those years reminds us that the fight for equality is not an event of the past but a responsibility of the present. It asks us to look closely at the world around us and to recognize where the shadows of history still linger, shaping the lives of today. As we close this chapter together, remember that history is not just about what came before, it is about what we choose to do with its lessons now. By learning, reflecting, and sharing these stories, we honor those who endured and ensure their struggles were not in vain. If you found this journey meaningful, I invite you to support this channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others who value uncovering the truths of our past. Together, we can continue shining light on the stories that matter, keeping history alive so that its mistakes are not repeated. Thank you for spending this time here. May these stories inspire thought, compassion, and courage as you rest. Wishing you a peaceful night and a good sleep.